It was the kind of morning that made you pull your coat a little tighter and breathe just a bit slower. Crisp, amber light falling through thinning trees, with the smell of damp leaves and brewed coffee hanging in the air like a quiet hymn. In the heart of Lexington, Kentucky, there sat a modest cafe with fogged-up windows and a weathered sign that read Morning Light Cafe. The bell over the door rang softly with every new customer, and the hum of conversations blended with the gentle clink of silverware. It was the kind of place where folks knew your name, and if they didn't, they still smiled at you like they did. In a booth near the window, where condensation curled like tiny ghosts on the glass, sat a boy no older than 9. His knees were pulled up to his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around them, and his oversized hoodie swallowed most of his small frame. His name was Eli Lawson. And while everything outside seemed to move with the rhythm of a peaceful morning, Eli remained still, not from calm, but from something heavier. Since the accident, he hadn't said a word. 3 months earlier, his mother Anna had been hit by a drunk driver just 3 blocks from their home. It was a Tuesday, just another ordinary day, until it wasn't. One moment, she was humming a lullaby in the car, reaching for Eli's hand from the driver's seat. The next, there was a screech, a crash, and a silence that swallowed everything. Eli had survived, but something inside him hadn't. The doctors called it selective mutism and severe anxiety disorder, but all his father Richard knew was that his son didn't speak, didn't smile, and couldn't bear loud noises. The once bubbly boy who used to name clouds and chase birds now jumped at the slightest sound, especially the sharp ding of bells or sudden laughter. He hadn't returned to school. He barely left the house. And yet, here he was today, in this tiny cafe, at his father's urging. Every time the front door creaked open, the bell above it chimed, and every single time, Eli flinched. He would press his palms over his ears, lower his head, and rock slightly, like he was trying to disappear. The other patrons tried not to stare, but the tension in the room shifted each time. Some looked away. Some whispered. No one knew what to do. Except one person. From behind the counter, a young waitress named Annie Harper noticed him. She had seen hundreds of customers walk through that door over the years, but something about the boy pulled at her, not just the way he sat, trembling and withdrawn, but the quiet cry in his eyes. It was the kind of look a person didn't learn to fake. It was the look of someone lost. Annie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter, her eyes never leaving the boy. She didn't carry a menu. She didn't bring water. She just walked over, slowly, carefully, and knelt beside the booth, her voice gentle but steady. "Hi, sweetheart. You don't have to talk. I'm just gonna sit here for a moment, if that's okay." Eli didn't respond. He didn't move. But for the first time in weeks, he didn't pull away either. And Annie stayed. Quiet, still, and present, like a lighthouse for someone lost at sea. The bell over the cafe door wasn't loud, just a soft ring-ring, the kind of sound that barely drew attention on a normal day. But for Eli, it might as well have been thunder. Each time it chimed, his small body jerked as if struck by lightning. His hands flew to his ears, pressing hard, as if trying to shut out not just the sound but the world around him. His knees pulled tighter against his chest, and his whole frame trembled like a leaf caught in a sudden gust. It didn't matter how gently the door opened. It didn't matter that the people walking in were kind-faced neighbors, or that the sound lasted only a second. To Eli it was a reminder, of sirens, of screams, of the chaos that had stolen his mother and shattered his world. The other customers noticed, of course. Some gave sympathetic glances. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Richard, standing just a few feet away, would close his eyes for a moment each time it happened, not in frustration, but in heartbreak. He had tried everything: therapy, medication, silence, talking. Nothing had changed the fact that his son now lived in fear of the smallest, simplest sounds. And yet, he kept bringing Eli here. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only place outside their house where Eli would agree to go. Maybe it was the warm light. Maybe it was the quiet hum. Or maybe, just maybe, It had something to do with the waitress who never looked at Eli with pity, only understanding. Richard Lawson stood beside the booth, one hand resting on the back of the seat, the other curled loosely at his side. His eyes were heavy, dark circles beneath them betraying months of sleepless nights and endless worry. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of a grief he didn't know how to carry and a responsibility he feared he was failing. He had once been a man of action, a provider, a fixer. But no matter how many therapists he hired, how many treatments he researched, or how many promises he whispered to his son late at night, nothing had worked. Eli remained locked in his silence, unreachable, trembling at the slightest sound. And now, here they were again, in the same booth, on the same morning route Richard hoped might spark something familiar in his son. Anything. But Eli was hunched into himself like always, shrinking away from the world, his face buried beneath the brim of his hoodie. Across the room, Annie Harper paused mid-step. She had seen them before. The quiet man with the faraway stare. The boy who never looked up. But today was different. Maybe it was the way the light caught Eli's eyes. Maybe it was the faint shimmer of tears that hadn't yet fallen. Whatever it was, something inside her stirred. A kind of knowing. She didn't grab a notepad. She didn't ask what they wanted. Instead, she slowly made her way across the cafe floor, her sneakers silent against the old tile. When she reached the table, she knelt, not in a rushed, awkward way, but gently, like someone approaching a wounded animal. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just opened her arms. Not wide. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to say, I see you. And I'm not here to fix you. I'm just here. For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened. Eli didn't move. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, and his small fingers twitched where they gripped his sleeves. Then, without warning, he shifted. He scooted forward, inch by inch, like he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. And then, with the quietest of movements, he folded himself into Annie's arms. No words. No sound. Just the soft rustle of fabric and the sudden heartbreaking wetness of tears soaking into her apron. Annie held him. She didn't rock him or pat his back. She simply stayed, one hand resting gently on his shoulder, the other cradling the back of his head. Her own eyes shimmered, but she didn't let them fall. Across from them, Richard covered his mouth with his hand. His vision blurred. For the first time in months, maybe longer, he felt something crack inside him. Not the breaking of more despair, but the breaking open of something else. Hope. Fragile, trembling hope. And in that moment, inside a quiet cafe on a cold morning, a man who had spent months feeling utterly helpless cried. The next morning, something happened that hadn't happened in months. Eli woke up before the sun. Richard found him already sitting on the edge of his bed, hoodie sleeves bunched around his wrists, eyes wide but calm. There was a small whiteboard on his lap, the kind they'd used in therapy, now mostly abandoned in the corner of the room. But today, Eli had pulled it close and written something in big, uneven letters. She is safe. Richard stared at the message for a long time. His throat tightened. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Just 2 words, that was all, and yet it felt like the sound of his son's voice echoing across a canyon. It was the first time Eli had voluntarily written something about another person. The first time he'd communicated not out of necessity, but out of connection. She is safe. Those words held something sacred. A child's fragile trust, quietly placed into the hands of a stranger who hadn't tried to fix him, only held him. It wasn't a sentence. It was a vow. And Richard understood with startling clarity what that hug in the cafe had meant to his son. Without waiting, he pulled on a jacket and grabbed his keys. 20 minutes later, Richard stood awkwardly at the counter of the Morning Light Cafe. The morning rush hadn't started yet, and the place still smelled like rising dough and burnt espresso. Annie was behind the register, humming softly as she wiped down menus. She looked up, startled to see him, the the stiff man with kind eyes who usually hovered near the door. "Hi," she said cautiously. "Is everything okay?" Richard hesitated. He wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from someone who wasn't wearing a white coat or holding a clipboard. But this woman, this waitress, had done more in a 5-minute hug than months of professionals. "He wrote something," Richard said softly. "This morning. On his board." Annie paused. "What did he write?" He pulled out his phone and showed her the photo. She stared at it, and her lips parted, just slightly. Then, without a word, she looked up at him. "I don't know what you did," Richard continued, voice rough. "But he trusts you. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to come by the house. Just a few times a week. Not as a nurse or a therapist. Just as someone who gets him." Annie didn't answer right away. Her gaze dropped to the floor. There was a long silence, broken only by the hiss of the coffee machine. "I lost my daughter 2 years ago," she said finally. "Heart defect. She was 9. Just like him." Richard blinked. The weight of her words hung in the air like dust. "Since then, I haven't been around kids. Couldn't even be near a playground without crying." Another pause. "But something about Eli. I don't know. Maybe I'm not ready. Or maybe this is how I start healing too." She looked up, eyes steady. "I'll come." Richard nodded, his voice too thick to reply. He reached out and shook her hand, not as a father hiring someone, but as one grieving soul reaching for another. Annie Harper sat in the break room of the Morning Light Cafe long after her shift had ended, her apron folded neatly on the counter, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The offer Richard had made, to visit Eli, to spend time with him at their home, played on a loop in her mind like a song she couldn't turn off. It wasn't the first time someone had asked her to work with children again. Friends had suggested it gently, therapists had encouraged it. But Annie had always said no. Not because she didn't love children, but because she had once loved one too much, and then lost her. Her daughter, Lila, had been the brightest part of her world. A giggling, dimpled little girl with a laugh that could fill a room. But her heart had betrayed her. A defect they couldn't fix. One hospital stay turned into months, and one final night turned into a lifetime of silence. Since then, Annie hadn't dared open the door to that part of herself again. The part that knew lullabies by heart, that saved every crayon drawing, that remembered the exact weight of a sleeping child in her arms. That part of her had been locked away. For protection. For survival. But then Eli had walked, or rather trembled, into her cafe. He hadn't spoken a word. Hadn't even looked at her at first. And yet somehow in his silence, he had called out to her. That moment, when he leaned into her arms, trusting her without a word, something cracked. Not painfully. Not all at once. Just enough for the light to get in. Now she sat in the quiet, thinking about that light. Annie knew this wasn't about money. Richard hadn't offered a number, and she wouldn't have asked. This was about something deeper, something neither of them had been able to name yet. A wounded boy who had stopped speaking, and a grieving mother who had stopped feeling like one. She stood slowly, her legs a little stiff from sitting so long. On the counter beside her coffee cup was a photograph she kept tucked into her wallet. Lila on her 7th birthday, frosting smeared across her cheeks, laughing like the world had never known sadness. Annie looked at it for a moment, then carefully placed it back. Maybe this wasn't about leaving Lila behind. Maybe it was about carrying her forward, into the heart of another child who needed something she still had left to give. Not lessons. Not therapy. Just presence. Just arms open, ready to hold someone else's brokenness without needing to fix it. That night, Annie called Richard. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke, but her words were clear. "I'll come by tomorrow, around 3. No need to make it formal. I'm not bringing anything but myself." There was a pause on the other end. "That's all he needs," Richard said quietly. And Annie smiled for the first time in what felt like years, not because the pain was gone, but because for once, it had somewhere to go. The Lawson estate sat on a quiet hill overlooking Lexington, a sprawling property with winding driveways, towering windows, and rooms that echoed with silence more than laughter. It was the kind of home people admired from the outside, elegant, polished, filled with all the right things. Therapists came and went, each with crisp credentials and confident voices. They brought charts and progress plans. They spoke in careful tones and referenced studies. But none of them stayed long. None of them reached Eli. And then came Annie Harper. She arrived without fanfare, just a modest coat, a canvas bag, and a hesitant smile that said she wasn't entirely sure what she was doing here. A housekeeper led her through the grand hallways, past oil paintings and marble busts, until they reached a sunroom where Eli sat curled up in the corner, drawing invisible lines on the foggy glass. He didn't look up. He never did. Annie didn't speak. She just slid off her shoes and sat on the floor across from him, pulling a napkin from her pocket. Slowly, she began folding, crease by crease, until a delicate paper crane formed between her fingers. She set it gently on the rug and gave it a little nudge. Eli's eyes flicked toward it. That was enough. The next day, she brought another. And the next, a third. Within a week, the corner of the sunroom had become a tiny aviary of paper cranes, each one folded in silence, each one placed gently within reach, not as a gesture of healing, but as a quiet invitation. Annie never asked Eli to talk. She didn't coax or prompt or guide. Instead, she told stories, silly ones, about the people at the cafe, about the time she spilled a tray of orange juice on a man who didn't even flinch, or the regular who claimed to be a retired magician but only knew one card trick. Eli never laughed out loud. But once, he smiled. Just barely. Just long enough for Annie to see it. Some days they played with scraps of paper, folding frogs and boats. Other days, they just sat in silence, watching the rain slide down the windows in thin, silver streaks. Annie brought a small cloth and showed him how to fold it into a heart. She didn't explain why. He didn't ask. But it was what she did when he startled, and he startled often. A loud door. A dropped fork. The hum of the vacuum down the hall. Each time, Eli would shrink into himself, shoulders clenched, breath caught. And each time, Annie would gently extend her hand. Not forcefully. Not quickly. Just open. Still. Waiting. At first, he ignored it. Then one day he took it. Tiny fingers slipped into hers like a whisper, and she held on just tight enough to say, "You're safe." It became their rhythm. The house staff watched in quiet amazement. The therapists, still employed but now mostly observing, took notes they didn't fully understand. And Richard, who had once stood with arms folded, skeptical and guarded, now lingered in doorways, his gaze softening with each passing visit. Eli didn't change overnight. He still flinched. Still struggled. Still drifted into long silences. But he no longer walked them alone. Because Annie wasn't there to fix him. She was just there. And somehow, that was exactly what he needed. The voices in the meeting room were calm, measured, and laced with clinical precision. Around the long walnut table sat three of the most highly recommended child development experts in the state, therapists, behavioral analysts, and pediatric specialists. They reviewed charts, behavioral logs, and observations from recent weeks, each speaking in turns, each trying not to dismiss what they clearly didn't understand. "It's commendable that he's showing signs of attachment," said Dr. Warren, flipping through his notes. "But we have to consider whether this form of emotional dependence is sustainable." "Her methods are unstructured," added another. "There's no therapeutic framework. No documented strategy. It's just presence. And presence, while comforting, is not a treatment." Richard sat at the head of the table, hands clasped in front of him, jaw tight. He listened, as he always did. After all, these were the people he'd sought out, spent months researching, flying in for consultations. He wanted the best for Eli, and according to every professional standard, these people were it. But none of them had seen what he had. None of them had been standing at the doorway the night Eli left a cookie and a hand-drawn note on the entry table. Just a single oatmeal cookie, the kind Annie always brought from the cafe, resting on a napkin, beside a note scribbled in crooked handwriting, for Miss Annie. That same morning, Richard had found a crayon drawing on the kitchen counter. It showed a boy with stick arms standing next to a smiling woman with curly hair and an apron. Above their heads was a small heart, and in the corner, Eli had written a single word, safe. Richard didn't know what to do with that. Every time the expert spoke of Annie, her lack of credentials, her informal approach, he felt torn. Because they were right. On paper, she wasn't qualified. She wasn't a therapist. She didn't take notes. She didn't set goals. All she did was show up, sit beside his son, and be there. But wasn't that what had been missing? Before Annie, Eli never let anyone close. He flinched a touch, recoiled from strangers, and barely acknowledged the world around him. Now, he waited by the window before her visits. He folded napkins into little animals and left them by the door. He reached for her hand when something startled him, not his father's, not a nurse's, hers. And somehow, that simple act of reaching had done more than any 6-week therapy module. Still, the voices kept echoing. We're concerned about boundaries. Her continued presence could create emotional confusion. We need to bring this back into a clinical space. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Then he thought about Annie's face the day she met Eli. She hadn't looked at him like a patient. She didn't analyze his symptoms or ask him to perform. She just opened her arms. And he came to her. Not because she had the right degree. Because she saw him. So when the meeting ended, and the professionals gathered their briefcases and parted with polite nods, Richard said nothing. He offered no agreement. No denial. Just a quiet, unreadable smile. Then he walked out of the room, turned toward the sunroom where paper cranes lined the windowsill, and made a silent decision. Let the experts write their reports. Annie stays. It started with a headline. At first, Richard barely noticed the folded newspaper tossed onto his desk, just another bundle of ink and gossip. But something about the photo caught his eye. A blurred shot taken through the iron gates of his estate. The image showed Annie, in her plain cafe uniform, standing beside Eli on the porch. His small hand clutched hers. Her face was turned toward him, warm, unguarded. And above it, the headline screamed in bold black letters. Waitress hugs billionaire's son, miracle worker or master manipulator? Richard's stomach twisted. He unfolded the paper slowly, reading each word like it might catch fire in his hands. The article was short, speculative, filled with insinuations about how a simple cafe waitress had gained access to one of the wealthiest families in Lexington. Phrases like suspiciously swift attachment and convenient tragedy leapt off the page. They questioned Annie's motives, painted her as someone seeking publicity or perhaps even a payout. By the time he reached the end of the column, Richard's hands were shaking. He didn't want to believe it. But once the seed was planted, doubt took root. How had the story gotten out? Who took that photo? How did a quiet, private miracle turn into public spectacle overnight? He stormed through the house, fury rising in his chest. The idea that someone might be exploiting his son, who had already suffered enough, was more than he could bear. That afternoon, when Annie arrived for her regular visit, Richard was waiting at the front door. He didn't invite her in. He didn't even let her speak. "Was it you?" he asked, voice tight. Annie blinked, confused. "What?" "The article. The photo. Was that your doing?" Her face went pale. "I would never, Richard, I don't even." But he cut her off. "You think I haven't seen this before? People pretending to care just to get close? To build a story? You held my son while someone took pictures from the gate. Don't tell me that's a coincidence. Annie's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't ask for this. I only came because Eli. Don't, Richard snapped. Don't use his name like that. Silence hung heavy between them. She took a slow breath. You're scared. I get it. But you know me better than this. I thought I did, he muttered. Then, quietly, almost broken. Please leave. Annie stood frozen for a moment. Then, with trembling hands, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a folded napkin, one of the same kind she always brought for Eli, and set it gently on the porch rail. He doesn't need someone to fix him, she said softly. He just needs someone who won't leave. Then she turned and walked down the steps, her footsteps light, but her heart heavy. Inside the house, Richard closed the door with more force than he meant to. But even as it latched shut, a flicker of uncertainty danced behind his anger. A whisper of something deeper than rage. Something that sounded a lot like regret. The silence after Annie left was heavier than any storm. Richard stood in the hallway, one hand still on the doorknob, listening to the absence she left behind. No soft footsteps on the marble, no gentle hum from the sunroom, no quiet rustle of paper cranes. The house, once filled with fragile hope, now felt hollow again. He told himself he had done the right thing. He was protecting his son. That's what any good father would do, wasn't it? But when he turned around, Eli was there. The boy stood at the top of the stairs, barefoot, his eyes wide and glistening. His chest rose and fell in short, panicked breaths, and his small hands clutched the whiteboard Annie had once given him. He didn't speak, he never did, but his shaking fingers scribbled a message in hurried strokes. Don't send her away. Richard's heart cracked in places he thought had long since hardened. He took a slow step forward. Eli. But the boy backed away, pressing himself against the wall like the air had turned to fire. His lips trembled, and tears spilled down his cheeks, not from noise or fear, but from something deeper. Loss. Again. He had let someone in. And now, she was gone. Richard tried to speak, but there were no words. No explanation that could make sense to a child who had already learned what it meant to be abandoned. Later that evening, after Eli finally cried himself to sleep, curled up in the sunroom, surrounded by paper cranes, Richard returned to the front porch. The wind had picked up, rustling the last few golden leaves clinging to the trees. That's when he saw it. A small, folded napkin. It sat gently on the railing, perfectly creased, shaped like a heart. Not flashy. Not showy. Just like her. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside, written in neat, slanted handwriting, were the words. He doesn't need someone to fix him. He just needs someone who won't leave. Richard stared at it, the weight of her words settling into his chest like a stone dropped in deep water. All this time, he had been searching for solutions. The best doctors, the most respected specialists, every program money could buy. But Annie, she had given Eli something none of them could. Not healing. Not progress. Just presence. And now she was gone, not because she failed, but because Richard couldn't see past his own fear. He stood there for a long time, the napkin fluttering lightly in his hand, the sky growing darker with every passing second. Behind him, the house was still. Too still. And for the first time in years, Richard Lawson, a man known for control, for resolve, for never looking back, felt something unfamiliar settle into his bones. Shame. It was 3 days of silence. 3 days without Annie's gentle laughter echoing down the hallway. 3 days of Eli refusing to eat more than a few bites, of retreating into a corner of the sunroom where his paper cranes began to gather dust. The light in the house seemed dimmer, not because the bulbs had changed, but because something vital had left with her. On the 4th morning, Richard sat alone in his study, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He stared out the window, replaying every moment, the article, the accusations, the look in Annie's eyes before she walked away. He wanted to believe he'd done the right thing, protecting his son from someone who might not have had the best intentions. But that quiet voice of doubt had only grown louder. It was then that Matteo, the head of security, knocked lightly on the door. "Sir, there's something I think you need to know." Richard turned, nodding him in. Matteo hesitated before speaking, not out of fear but shame. He was a man used to precision, loyalty, control. And now, his voice was unsteady. "The photos, the ones in the paper, they didn't come from her." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Then where did they come from?" Matteo cleared his throat, looked down, then finally met Richard's gaze. "One of the junior guards. He admitted to taking them. Said he saw a chance to make some money, snapped the shots through the fence. Sold them to a tabloid under a fake name. Didn't think it would blow up the way it did." Richard stared at him, stunned. "You're telling me Annie had nothing to do with it?" Matteo shook his head slowly. "Nothing at all. She didn't know a thing. And sir, I think she really cared about your boy." The words landed with full weight. Richard leaned back in his chair, breath leaving his lungs like a slow exhale of guilt. His mind raced, back to the moment Annie had stood on the porch, trying to explain, her voice shaking. Back to the napkin heart. Back to the way Eli had silently begged him not to send her away. And he had done it anyway. He had doubted the one person who had never asked for anything. The one who had sat quietly with his son, asking for no recognition, no reward. Just someone who had loved without needing to be needed. A deep silence settled in the room. Then Richard stood. He didn't say another word. He left the study, walked past the grand stairwell, and paused at the sunroom door. Inside, Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, folding a napkin with shaky hands. It looked like he was trying to make another heart, but the folds weren't coming out right. Richard watched for a long moment. Then he whispered, mostly to himself, "I made a mistake." He didn't know yet how he'd fix it. But he knew where he had to go. The door to Eli's room creaked open slowly. Richard stepped inside, expecting the usual stillness, the half-drawn curtains, the scattered crayons, the faint hum of white noise from the corner speaker. But what caught his eye wasn't the quiet. It was the desk. There, spread out across the wooden surface, were dozens of paper cranes. Some neat and symmetrical, others wrinkled and rushed, all folded with small, determined hands. Each one seemed to carry a message, not written in ink, but in intention, in longing. And then, at the center, a single piece of paper. It wasn't a drawing. It wasn't a folded shape. Just a note. Scrawled in shaky, uneven handwriting, as if each letter took immense effort. "If you don't bring her back, I won't talk anymore." Richard stared at it, unmoving. The weight of the words hit harder than any accusation. His knees weakened, and he sank onto the edge of the bed, the note trembling in his hands. All this time, he'd chased specialists, poured money into treatments, hoping for breakthroughs. But the one person who had made his son feel safe, he had pushed her away. Not because she failed, but because he hadn't trusted what couldn't be measured. In that moment, Richard understood something he never had before. His son didn't need fixing. He needed someone who stayed. The bell above the cafe door rang softly, that familiar ring, but this time, it didn't startle anyone. Annie was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, her motions quiet and automatic. She hadn't seen Richard Lawson since the day he asked her to leave, and though she had tried to move on, her heart still paused every time a tall man stepped through the door. When she looked up and saw him standing there, same tailored coat, same tired eyes, her breath caught, but she didn't speak. She didn't need another goodbye. But Richard didn't look like a man here to say goodbye. He approached slowly, respectfully, as if stepping into sacred ground. In his hand was a folded piece of paper. He placed it gently on the counter in front of her, smoothing it out with both palms. Then he stepped back. Annie looked down. 5 words stared up at her, written in his unmistakable handwriting. Please come back. Be Mom. Tears pooled instantly in her eyes. She looked up at him, lips trembling, but again, no words were needed. Because in that moment, everything unspoken became understood. The apology, the regret, the plea, and most of all, the hope. Annie took the paper in her hands, folded it neatly, and held it to her chest. Then she nodded. She came back. But not as a guest, or a volunteer, or even as a caregiver. She came back as something much deeper, a constant. A safe harbor. A presence that no longer questioned her place. For Eli, it was as if the sun returned. He didn't speak right away, but the moment he saw her walk through the doors of the Lawson home he ran, not away, but toward her. And when she knelt down and opened her arms, he fell into them without hesitation, just like that very first day in the cafe. Over the following months, the house transformed. It wasn't just in the decorations or the laughter that began to echo through the once quiet halls. It was in the purpose. Annie had an idea, one that Richard supported without hesitation. Together, they turned a small wing of the estate into a sanctuary. Soft lighting, warm colors, shelves filled with crafts and folded animals. A space without clipboards, without diagnoses, without expectations. They called it Eli's Corner. It was a place for kids like Eli, children who didn't fit into neat boxes, who were told too often to act normal, speak up, or try harder. Here, no one was asked to perform. No one was asked to change. They were simply welcomed, as they were. There were soft rugs to curl up on. Storybooks in every corner. Quiet music, and always, open arms ready to hold trembling shoulders. Annie didn't lead therapy sessions. She made cocoa. She folded napkins into hearts. She listened. And Richard? He finally stopped trying to fix his son. Instead, he started learning from him. In Eli's Corner, the boy who once shrank from the world now helped other children feel safe in it. His silence wasn't a problem anymore. It was his gift. A reminder that love didn't always need words. Sometimes, it just needed someone who stayed. The room was full, not just with people, but with something deeper. Warmth. Anticipation. Hope. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and even a few therapists stood quietly in the newly finished space known as Eli's Corner. The soft hum of conversation drifted through the room, but everyone's eyes were drawn to the small boy standing near the front. Eli. He stood still for a moment, his hands at his sides, eyes scanning the crowd. Then he turned toward Annie, who knelt beside him, just like she had on that first day. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her and held tight. Then, with a voice that trembled but never wavered, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm okay now." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard stood frozen in place, his eyes wide. For a heartbeat, he didn't believe what he'd heard. But then he saw the tears on Annie's cheeks, and Eli's smile, and he knew. His son had spoken. For the first time in 2 years. Tears filled Richard's eyes, but this time, they weren't from fear or frustration. They were from something he had almost forgotten how to feel: peace. He looked around the room, then back at Annie and Eli, and realized. He hadn't saved his son. He had simply made space for someone who could. And in the stillness that followed, a quiet truth settled in everyone's heart. A child doesn't need to be fixed. They just need someone willing to stay. If you believe that kindness, the quiet kind, the patient kind, still has the power to change a life. If you believe that listening, truly listening, can reach a heart no expert ever could, then go ahead and tap that like button. And if stories like this one, stories of hope, humanity, and the healing power of simply being there, speak to something deep inside you, we'd love for you to stick around. Hit that subscribe button and join us here at Justice Reloaded HD. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who stay. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next story.